Now it's being recorded, so people missed my introduction. Anyways, take it away.
All right. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us. It's great to, I don't know, any excuse to talk about the Jijuktu'kwejk River, and the Watershed Alliance is always something I'm interested in doing. I'm sure you, Jonas, probably say the same for yourself.
Yeah, it's just I see the struggles that the river faces, and it feels good being out there, learning about it, and collecting data and understanding the river better.
Yeah. Before we get into it, can everyone hear us all right?
Yeah, I can certainly hear you. So I think you're very clear.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. So I'm Keeler Colton.
I'm Jonas Scow.
We're both board members of the Jijuktu'kwejk. And also, if anyone's having a little trouble understanding it, it's pronounced Jijuktu'kwejk. You kind of just say it all together. So the Jijuktu'kwejk, it's the original traditional name for what is now referred to as the Cornwallis River. But we would like anyone who's aware of that to just, I don't know, there's been a push to kind of change the name back to its, or not change the name, but refer to it as its original Mi'kmaq name. So from here on out, if you happen to think of it, think Jijuktu'kwejk instead of Cornwallis. It's a much better name for multitude of reasons. And yeah, so we're part of the Watershed Alliance. Today we're going to be talking about the general biodiversity in the river. We've both worked, last summer was my second year on the river, and Jonas's first summer. And we did a whole bunch of projects just looking at river health, some of the threats that face the river, and just got to spend a whole lot of time outside. So thank you so much for joining. And yeah, here we go.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce the watershed a little. The main stem, what people would consider the main stem of the Jijuktu'kwejk, extends from basically Berwick up there by the fire hall to Wolfville. To Wolfville, where the estuary meets the ocean. And there is a smaller section that goes up or comes down off of the North Mountain, which is basically just considered one of its tributaries. And historically, there were many more tributaries than there is now. About 177 tributaries were identified through the McCallum report. And now, unfortunately, we have only about 20 tributaries that are identified as flowing into the main stem of the Jijuktu'kwejk River. And this is, for the most part, due to the fact that over a quarter, 26% of the land in the watershed is used for agricultural purposes, whether that's cropping or livestock. So it's facing that challenge where it's just so much of the land is agricultural, and a lot of these streams are being used for irrigation and such. So we've just lost so many of those tributaries and spawning areas.
And there's just also been a big history of straight ditching and channeling streams to run like in between fields. So I would say the majority of the tributaries no longer flow to the river at all, just because they've been rerouted and end up in either ponds or just being absorbed in the soil. So it poses all sorts of threats to the river, as you can imagine. So the general biodiversity of the river has a crazy amount of biodiversity, all things considered. Back in the 70s, there was a study done, I believe, by the Department of Natural Resources, or whatever they happen to be called.
Might have been the Department of Lands and Forestry.
Lands and Forestry, yeah. They did a biodiversity study on the river, and they classified it as having one of the highest biomasses generally speaking, and in terms of fish in all of the Maritimes in the 70s. And it's not a huge river, all things considered. It's about 68 kilometers or so during the freshwater portion. And then you have your saltwater portion, which is going from about lower Kentville all the way out into Port Williams and Wolfville area. So there's just a whole lot of stuff there, a whole lot of unique species. We've got a photo here of an earth star. It's a mushroom that's specific to growing in pine barren regions. Because a lot of the valley floor used to be a pine barren, you just get all these interesting diversity. So it's extremely diverse, although there are many threats being faced by a lot of these species. What else here? Yeah, it also has just a lot of really good habitat as far as the valley floor goes. When looking between the South Mountain and the North Mountain, it's easy to just see fields. That's pretty much it. But if you happen to go on Google Earth or Google Maps and zoom out and just look over at the river or the general watershed, it's pretty, because it's got such a wide floodplain, it's pretty protected in that regard. And there's a lot of forest scattered throughout. There's Colebrook Provincial Park. Many of you have happened to visit that before, and many other places. So it's a bit of a safe haven for a lot of species and wildlife that live in the valley in Kings County, in the valley floor particularly, just because there's these wide reaches where it's just unable to be developed, more or less, due to how regularly it floods. So in contrast to that,
so we've got a whole list of threats that this river is facing, and we're going to kind of cover those throughout the presentation, but the main 8 would be, as you see, pollution, agricultural runoff, sedimentation, straight ditching, irrigation, climate change, urbanization, erosion. So the pollution and agricultural runoff, those could be kind of classed as the same sort of thing, but there's also pollution that comes from just the fact that there's so much human activity around the river that would tie into the urbanization. And sediment is a huge problem because as the sediment washes into the river, it covers up the stream bed, which is where the fish spawn. And if there's no spawning habitat, of course, then we're going to see the numbers of fish decline.
And in contrast to the research done in the 70s, classifying it as having like incredible biodiversity and one of the highest biomasses in the Maritimes, in 2007, it was later classified as being as making Canada's top 10 most endangered rivers list. And it was referred to and quoted in a news article as nothing more than a farm sewer. And that was just such a real blow, that the term, because I've heard that used before over the years. People be like, oh, it's such a dirty river, it's such a dirty river. And it may be polluted and have a whole lot of agricultural runoff in terms of pesticides, E. coli. There's many sewage treatment plants along the river, as well as some factories and rendering plants. So you get a whole lot of runoff, particularly when it rains. Just it's everything between the North Mountain, the South Mountain, more or less, kind of gets flushed in every rain. And considering that 26% of it's made of agricultural land, that's a whole lot of manure, pesticides, et cetera. So this has taken quite the toll on the river since the 70s and prior, and particularly around the 90s, as most of the townships along the river back in the day, up until, I believe, early 90s, including like Kentville and Berwick, they would pump their raw sewage straight into the river, which caused a whole slew of issues, as you can imagine. And it was, definitely, I'm very happy I was never around to see that, but you can just imagine how that would affect the river, and particularly the outward perspective of anyone else visiting the river at that time. So who are we? We are the Jijuktu'kwejk Watershed Alliance, and we already kind of went over ourselves a little bit, but the Jijuktu'kwejk Watershed Alliance, it's a group of concerned citizens located in Kings County who are concerned for the health of the Jijuktu'kwejk River. And as Soren mentioned, the Jijuktu'kwejk is also known as the Cornwallis River. So we have the goal of it someday obtaining a healthy, fishable, swimmable, drinkable watershed. So we just, it's a great group of folks. I highly suggest you check it out afterwards. We've got a whole lot of projects on the go that we'll get into. And I believe it's been around since, I want to say 2017 or 2016 or so. Yeah. And we've got quite a crew of folks and naturalists and biologists. So yeah, it's a pretty exciting summer, and every summer they hire a handful or 1 or 2 interns like ourselves who can go out there and just do whatever needs to be done, try to find more interesting things about the river and ways that we can protect it and help it. So if you can go there, Jonas. Yeah.
All right. So this past season, we spent, I would say, maybe 80% of our time at least out in the field, which is extremely lucky. And basically, we were just observing, collecting data, doing surveys, fishing, and we did some snorkeling. basically the key things we were looking for. We're trying to study the biodiversity surrounding beaver dams and areas with beaver dams. We're looking at water quality, so that would be temperature, pH, conductivity, dissolved solids, and E. coli. Cold water refugia was a big one, trying to figure out where fish go in the summer when temperatures get too hot for them. Atlantic salmon, we found some, and we were trying to figure out whether or not there was natural spawning occurring or not. Looking for endangered species and trying to figure out the impact of invasive species. All right. And turtle egg laying. We monitored that heavily in the sand pits surrounding Kentville and Bondrup.
Yeah, so it was a whole lot of fun. We had a lot of days where we were really just mucking about a lot of the time. We always had some goal in the day in mind. We were always working on some project, but it was just a whole lot of fun. And both Jonas and I have a really personal connection with the river, as we've been fly fishing it for years now, and it really brings out reasons for us to want to help this river and the species within it. Just because I've seen even over the last 6 years, just the deterioration, the loss of species, the introduction of invasive species, all sorts of things like that. So we're going to get right into some of our projects we've been working on this summer. All right, so one of our major projects this summer, we were trying to look at the effects of beaver dams and beaver activity on biodiversity. So the reason we were doing this is there's a lot of beavers on the river. And a lot of the tributaries and streams running into the river have a lot of beaver dams and activity. And there's a huge misconception out there that beavers negatively affect fish populations in terms of their damming. There's a lot of, still to this day, places in PEI, there's a lot of money put towards removing beaver dams because people claim they block fish passage, which can certainly be true. There can be massive beaver dams, but there's been many studies that have been proved since then that it doesn't, in fact, block fish passage all that much, as fish are very capable naturally. If you're thinking like thousands of years ago, they've been doing this for a very long time. And if beavers were in fact destroying habitat and blocking fish passage, they probably would have destroyed a lot of areas by now. But people also seem to think they damage ecosystems quite a bit, which is a bit of a misconception, as they more or less just provide floodplain habitat. They reduce sediment and all sorts of just very valuable things to the ecosystem, filtering out contaminants with their dams. So it is true, don't get me wrong, the beavers can be very destructive, but they can also be very constructive. And they can also really just, I don't know, they're kind of the guardians in a way of the river, because they're constantly rechanneling paths and helping out in a whole number of ways. So we were interested in setting up things called beaver dam analog structures. And what that is, a beaver dam analog structure it's an encouragement, I want to say, device that's placed inside rivers in areas where there's beavers, which would encourage them to build dams. And this is all that it is it's usually willows or alder branches that are staked quite deep into the ground in the middle of the river in certain areas where there's beaver activity. And what happens, you just leave them there, you weave some willow branches between them, and it's sort of just like a very large loose fence, just a little wall. Typically you'd put around anywhere from 3 to a dozen in a river. And what beavers do a lot of the time when they're building dams is they're not just building dams out of thin air. They can't just immediately start placing logs in the middle of a swift current. So they look for log jams and they look for trees or boulders or somewhere that can give them a bit of a head start. So these have been implemented all over the West Coast, and they've been extremely successful. But there hasn't been any on the East Coast thus far. So we were trying to see if we could find certain regions of the watershed that had been highly eroded, deteriorated, or maybe had just really wide banks, or really, really shallow banks, because beavers, when they trap their sediment up against these dams here, it just builds up the banks on the upstream portion of these dams, because it just traps sediment that runs down over time. So they can be incredibly helpful in sort of fighting the effects of degradation against rivers. So how do we do this? How do we go about this? So we couldn't just throw out a bunch of beaver dam analog structures, we kind of had to need some proof that putting beaver dams all over the river will in fact increase biodiversity and be helpful. So our main project was we were sort of doing a comparison of health and biodiversity between beaver dam areas and areas that had beavers but didn't have dams in them. So I'll show you that here. Yeah, so as you can see, we had 6 sites. We had 3 without dams and 3 with dams. And we went through all of these with all these bullet points you see here, all the different means of assessments in terms of assessing the health of the river and the watershed. And all these sites were selected. They're all very similar in size. They were all very similar in terms of habitat and ecosystem. But we were mostly just seeing whether or not areas that were dammed had more biodiversity and greater health than areas that weren't. And just to sort of prove it there. So we had about, I believe it was 200 meters on either side of the dam that we used as our reach area, as well as the adjacent riparian zones. So we did bird surveys, aquatic invertebrate surveys, fish surveys, tested for water quality, and we had some long-term temperature monitors in there as well that would just give readings about every hour or so. And it was a whole lot of fun to hang around beavers all day. And we got a whole lot of information from doing all of these surveys as well that didn't necessarily apply directly to the beavers, but we just got to learn a whole lot about the biodiversity in the watershed.
All right, so we had some very promising results from our beaver study, and we found in all cases where there was beaver dams, they had greater health and biodiversity on average to the ones without. So we found more fish, and that was more quantity, and there was also a wider range of species. We also were able to identify some sites for future beaver dam analog structure projects, and we gained information on many tributaries showing that with beavers there, pretty much everything is just boosted.
Absolutely, yeah. Like it was quite incredible to see how much more biodiversity, how much healthier these were, just in regards to the riparian assessments and everything else we'd done. And we spent about, I would say, at least half of the summer involved in this here. And the candidate sites that we identified, we were mostly looking for sites that had high erosion, that had the lowest health out of all of the sites in terms of all of the methods we used to assess them, and say, okay, like if we put a dam here, is this going to help this area? Is going to help with the erosion? Is going to increase biodiversity? So that was our main goal there. So it was extremely successful. And yeah, it was a lot of fun as well.
One of the biggest problems we're facing is because there is almost no crown land on the river, or even on a lot of the tributaries. So much of it is farmland, and farmers don't usually take too kindly to beavers. So we kind of have to work around where we pick these sites, because we don't want to flood out a farm field or anything like that.
Yeah, no, and not a lot of people around here like beavers, which is a shame, because they're just quite fascinating and very helpful. So another project we had going on was we were looking at turtle nesting areas throughout the watershed. So all the species of turtles we have in the watershed, that being the snapping turtle, the painted turtle, and I'm going to cross my fingers on this, the wood turtle. We have yet to confirm a wood turtle, but we've had many sightings and we've heard that they've been there for many, many years. So we were doing this where more or less we're kind of just searching around throughout the breeding season throughout May and June for these turtles, and using GPSs, just logging all the waypoints, trying to find how many there are. And then we were monitoring some of these areas as well with trail cameras to look at predation. And many of these nest sites, in fact, I would say 90% of them were all in active sand pits or construction sites, which is quite worrying because not only did the eggs get run over, there was constantly ATV tracks and bulldozer tracks and what have you. All over these nests, but because they're so open in these large areas and they're quite urban, especially like, if, for example, the one you can see there, that's right quite close to the main street in Kentville. And that was an area there where we had at least around, I want to say, 20 or so nests, all within about a quarter of an acre. And it's just it's quite troubling to see them all run over. And in fact, there was some points in which, while moving sand and moving gravel around, that entire areas of nests that were completely covered by just piles of gravel or completely excavated. So we wanted to get a good idea of exactly where they're spawning and where they're breeding, because we've been looking into it for a few years now, and we've been kind of collaborating a little with the Department of Natural Resources in that respect, by just sharing with them this information, see if there's anything that can be done about it. And as well as the painted turtles, the same deal goes for them, but the majority of the nests were the snapping turtles. There are a lot of painted turtles on the river, but snapping turtles they're so large and obvious. They have quite a presence to them. So there was a whole lot of snapping turtles, particularly around the Kentville area and in other construction sites and sand pits throughout.
Okay, so water quality has been certainly a worry for us because we're out there so often and in the water and around the water, and as we know, it's not the cleanest of rivers, but we went about doing water testing. We did three runs using handheld probes, which would measure temperature, conductivity, pH, and total dissolved solids. And these sites were from Berwick to Kentville, spread out
5 kilometers, I'd say.
Yes, yeah, something like that. So we got a good idea. We basically just picked the river crossings where there's bridges, and we noticed that Berwick seemed to have the worst water quality. Berwick, and then just downstream from Berwick, and then it would get better as you go down towards Lovett Road, which happens to be the most wooded area. And then after Lovett Road, it again gets a little worse as you go down into Kentville.
Yeah, and it's quite strange because typically speaking, when you're looking at rivers and the general water quality, in terms of water quality and water health, you'd find that the end of the river where it's about to flow into the ocean is just because you have so many streams and so much water building up as you go downstream, that would typically have the worst water quality, where it's quite fascinating that it's the polar opposite, more or less, for the Jijuktu'kwejk. And these graphs here, they're going kind of chronologically, Berwick Fire Hall, like it's the headwaters and then moving downstream. So it's quite interesting, and it's got quite a high pH. It's on average, I believe it's just around 7.5, maybe 7.4 or so, which is quite high for a lot of rivers around here, which is quite interesting. And it is important to keep in mind all of our water quality testing was in the middle of the summer. So it was expected that we're going to have quite warm water temperatures. And this also affects the pH as well during low water levels. But even so, between June and the end of July, there was many days where the water temperatures exceeded 20 degrees. Sometimes they got up to 21 degrees. And as we'll show you later on, it got a lot higher than that as well. And that's very, very damaging to the ecosystem. It just results in a lot of algal blooms and so on. So something that was incredibly worrying, we were also testing for E. coli, and we've done this for a number of years now at the exact same sites as previously mentioned. And this was done by we'd take E. coli samples and do one set at low water conditions. So this would be if there hadn't been rain for about a week or two, or sometimes a month, depending on the summer. So this sort of gives us a baseline for what it's like, typically speaking, as it's expected to go skyrocketing when after rain and high water, because there's so much agriculture and runoff. But what we found at first was we were quite concerned when we got our baseline samples, because then the baseline samples for reference they're the top graph there, as they were all quite high. So just for reference, it's measured in colony forming units per 100 milliliters. So the E. coli health recommendations throughout Canada, it's not recommended that you swim in anything that's got over 88. You shouldn't drink anything at all that's got E. coli in it. It has to be 0. And crop irrigation shouldn't be done with water that has E. coli levels over 100 colony forming units per 100 mils. And some of these are quite highly regulated as well, particularly the crop irrigation, because you can imagine if you're spraying crops with E. coli and that's being eaten, there's a lot of potential there for an E. coli outbreak. So when we did our high water samples, as you can see, it far surpassed any regulations whatsoever. It was exceeded 20,000 E. coli forming units in Willow Avenue in Berwick, which is just the top regions of the watershed. This would be right below a chicken rendering plant as well, so that doesn't help. And as it would flow out to Kentville, it got slightly lower and lower over time, but still extremely worrying. And it's worth noting that there's not going to be any crop irrigation taking place during these high water conditions, as they have enough water during those times. They don't need to suck water out of the river or anything like that. But even still, afterwards, even a few days, there could potentially be crop irrigation, and that poses all sorts of risks. Not even crops as well. Just if you're fishing or whatnot, it doesn't take a whole lot to get in your system before something could happen. So we thought this was very worrying, particularly around the crop irrigation side of things. And it's more or less a result of during low water conditions, the water just gets so low because while it's hot, the hotter it gets, the more irrigated it gets, and then the lower the water levels get. And it's just kind of like a repeated cycle. So when it does rain, everything's usually so cracked out and dry that it doesn't have time to soak into the valley floor. Between the North and South Mountain, it would just kind of, not a flash flood, but it would pick up everything and deposit it right into the river. So that's something that is probably one of the more concerning things we found this summer.
Okay, so a little bit about the cold water refuge again. We've got brook trout and brown trout in the Jijuktu'kwejk River. The brown trout were introduced years ago, over 100 years ago. Yeah. And they have certainly established themselves, but they haven't seemed to have had a very negative effect on the brook trout population, which is good because we don't want any sort of invasive species. So trout will begin to experience stress when water temperatures go above 18.5 degrees Celsius. And what happens is when the water reaches that point, dissolved oxygen begins to dissipate. And because fish breathe through the water, they need that dissolved oxygen to live. And once this oxygen level starts getting lower and lower, that puts stress on the fish. And once it hits 21 degrees, it's actually considered lethal. So during these times, the trout are forced to seek out colder water. Now that could mean they go up into a tributary that has colder water for the remainder of the warm season, or they will find the mouth of a tributary, usually in the main stem of the river, and they'll hold there. And it's usually in great numbers, as you can see in the bottom left there. That's a picture from one of our sites downstream from Black Rock Road. And there's a stream that runs in there, and in the summer when it's warm, you could bet your life on it, there's going to be a big bunch. It's 50 to 100 fish just sitting there. And it's because it's the only place in that stretch of water where there's cold water. There's no shade or anything. It's just, it gets way too hot. And this is due to irregular rainfall. As you know, we only had a few rains last summer, and the summer before that we had even less. The irrigation, again, if there's a long period of no rain, then they're pulling water from the river, so that will get the temperature up as well. The climate change, that's just not really anything we can control at this point, but that's adding to it especially. And yeah, there's just all these things are bringing the temperature of the river up, and it's having a detrimental effect on the fish, and not only the fish, but the invertebrates and other animals that the fish feed on are also taking a hit because of the lowered oxygen content in the water.
And it just poses a lot of threats as well to the fish holding in these areas, because they're so restricted to such a small area where these tiny creeks are running in, these cold spring creeks. And oftentimes they would be probably, I'm going to do it with my hands, it sounds silly, but it would be about this big of an area just stacked up with fish, usually around, like I would say,
the
around
size of a basketball backboard or something.
Yeah, about like 3 meters squared or so at most. And there's just a whole lot of fish there. But because there's no protection in these areas, just by happenstance, they're just so out in the open. It's usually not very deep. There's usually no cover. So they're very vulnerable to predators. And fishermen as well. So you think that there's going to be high water temperatures, shouldn't fish, just because a lot of the time the fish they get real stressed out. And they also, more often than not, they stop completely, will shut off feeding. So if you prolong these events where they must be holding in these areas, eventually they can get a little emaciated, and it can just take quite a hit to the population. So what we were doing is we were looking at where exactly are these cold water refuge areas, where are the largest ones, because if these hold such concentrations of fish, it's pretty important that we should protect these areas as they're just loaded with species. And if we could help them out in any way, that would be great. So what we did is we were looking, I think we had 5 different sites throughout the watershed, all that were used for cold water refugia. And we would monitor the temperature of the actual inflow, and we had temperature loggers placed exactly where the fish happened to be holding, just right underneath them. They're tiny little things, so they didn't quite get in their way or anything like that. And it would monitor the temperature as well as the temperature upstream. So the temperature upstream would be the regular water temperature of the river, and downstream would be just where these are flowing into the main stem of the river. And sometimes these creeks are no more than a foot across. They can be extremely small. So as you can see here, we've got the top graph here is just upstream. So this would be the warmer water, and it was just a little over 20 degrees Celsius on average. And downstream was 18.6 degrees Celsius. And these temperature monitors were no more than 5 meters apart from one another. And the river was, at some points 13, 15 feet wide. And these tiny little creeks just had so much, because the cold water sinks to the bottom of the river, it doesn't mix right away. So it leaves this pocket where the trout are able to hold. If you notice at the top of this graph here, on the top there was periods of time where the temperature of the river went up to 26 degrees Celsius. And this is, keep in mind, 2 feet under the water as well. And there's no sunlight penetrating these. We made sure of that to make sure it was exclusively just the water temperature. So there was 2 days in a row where it hit up to 26 degrees, and that would result in oftentimes a lot of fish die off. So what our goal was here is, our end goal is to identify where the most important refugia sites are and see what we can do in terms of restoration, because many are very eroded, protection, and tree planting to provide more shade in these areas and to provide protection from predators. And also something we're really doing a lot of this year is just looking for endangered species and species at risk. And
we started off by looking for wild leeks, actually, which are also referred to as ramps sometimes. They supposedly grow throughout the watershed in the woodlands that border the river, but we weren't able to find any this year.
We were they come out around now, or even earlier. So
yeah,
we started in the game a little late. So once the grass all grows up, they just you can't see them. They're so small.
We spent a great deal of time looking for bank swallows because we've observed them many times.
About 100.
Many birds too. Yeah, and on different occasions, mostly in the Waterville area, but we've also seen them up in the Berwick area by the sewage treatment plant and down below Lovett Road in Kentville. We haven't been able to identify any nesting sites, but we know that they're here, so they must be nesting somewhere. We spent some time looking for wood turtles, but that was also pretty difficult as we didn't get out in the field last year until June. So by then, all the grasses and such had grown up to a level where if there was a turtle on the banks, we wouldn't have a chance at seeing it. But there are reports, like Keeler said before, of wood turtles in the area, and the most recent would have been 2018 in the Coldbrook area. There was a report by an older fellow.
I believe there was also one in Berwick, the Berwick Fire Hall parking lot at some point years ago, and we had a number of reports, but it's usually it's a hard thing to get a photograph of, and that's typically what you need to do in order to prove it, because it's who's to say when a turtle is about 30-50 feet away if it instantly just goes into the water. Because we had a number of folks say they saw them, but there was a lot of Bigfoot style videos that were sent to us, and unfortunately we just couldn't quite get a good enough look at them. But we know that they're there. At least there's excellent habitat for them. And if we were able to properly just confirm their presence here, as well as the bank swallows, and which we've already done a bit of, it just kind of opens doors to provide a little more protection for these species from the government as well, just the presence of having these endangered species.
We also spent some time, it was actually more happenstance. We were fishing and we caught an Atlantic salmon par, which was a surprise to us, of course, because salmon are considered extirpated from the Jijuktu'kwejk River. And we went on to snorkel this same stream and identified what we think to be a few more salmon par. And we contacted the Coldbrook Biodiversity Facility, and they told us that they hadn't stocked within, what was it?
It was
24
years now, yeah.
Yeah. So we determined
There's a slide.
that we determined that it would have had to have been due to natural spawning. So it's promising on the Atlantic salmon front, at least more promising than the bank swallows and wood turtles. Painted turtles we didn't see a whole lot of, but we got our eyes on some. We didn't see any nesting sites or anything like that.
There were a few, I think. I mean, I don't know if we knew whether they were painted or not.
Yeah,
I guess it was just a hole in the ground.
Yeah, I couldn't say. We didn't get any on the trail cameras, which is what we were hoping for, but that didn't work out. And eastern white cedars, we found some of those in the watershed, which those are very rare. So it was good to see those.
I believe there's only a few thousand in all of Nova Scotia these days, isolated to a few pockets. So yeah, it was great to see them, especially ones as large as they were.
And we noticed that some landowners have actually started planting trees along the river, and we saw some eastern white cedars. So it's great to see that that landowners are out there planting native species and helping the river out in that sense.
So just to touch on a bit of a little bit more on the Atlantic salmon. So yeah, it was, as Jonas said, complete happenstance. We were fishing for unrelated reasons, as we do. And we got a number of, I think it was 4 total that were confirmed, identified Atlantic salmon par and smolt, all confirmed via scale samples through DFO and other folks, I believe, from the Nova Scotia Salmon Association. So this is really interesting for the river because, as Jonas said, they were declared extirpated many, many years ago. And they used to have a mighty salmon run, which made the river extremely popular back in the day, sort of 70s and onward, and prior as well, for Atlantic salmon fishing. And it was considered one of the best rivers around for Atlantic salmon fishing. It had guides and benches at every pool, more or less. There was fly shops along the river. So it was quite interesting to see these here because they're quite unexpected. And there is stocking that goes on. They would stock unfed par and fry into some of these tributaries where the salmon would normally have spawned. However, these par, through the scale samples, we could see that they were no more than 2.5 years old. And seeing as they hadn't stocked in 4 years in the first tributary we found them in, we were almost certain that they were wild. Now, whether or not they are escaped hatchery fish from open net pens or Gaspereau genetic Atlantic salmon, and fingers crossed, genetically Cornwallis salmon or Jijuktu'kwejk salmon rather. It's uncertain. We haven't quite got there. The labs are all backed up quite a bit these days in terms of salmon, so no one was really too interested in getting their hands on any of that to really conclusively say where they came from. But later in the year, we were again snorkeling and fishing in another tributary that had never been stocked ever. There was no stocking history of it whatsoever. And we got another smolt there and some other sightings as well through fishing and snorkeling. I'll mention we weren't targeting these fish at all. It's illegal. We were fishing for trout. Timer there. Okay, we'll speed up a little bit. But yeah, it was really great to see. And as a result of this, we've got some support from Dalhousie and Nova Scotia Salmon Association, and there's going to be a large-scale electrofishing project that's going to be going through a number of streams and tributaries throughout the river this coming summer. And for, I believe it's a 2-year project. So it was quite exciting to get the ball rolling on some of that and just get, I don't know, get the word out there, because it's gone so under the radar. It's been so long since anyone's seen them. I mean, I'm sure that there is the odd salmon in the river as an adult, but no one's really sure where they come from. And a lot of the time, more often than not, they're just escaped from open net pens. So it was nice to get some conclusive evidence just to get the ball rolling a little bit.
So here we have, I would consider the biggest threat to Jijuktu'kwejk River, the chain pickerel that was introduced about 3, maybe 4 years ago. That's when we started noticing them. And we believe that someone had a private pond, and during the spring floods, the pickerel made it into the river. And it's had devastating effects in other watersheds. It's kind of hard to really get a handle on how much effect they're having in the Jijuktu'kwejk right now, since it's only been a few years. But if other watersheds are an example of what happens with these fish, then I think something really needs to be done about this, because they can eat anything in this river. Whereas before, with just trout, you know, most of the frogs are safe, and the snakes and the mice and all sorts of stuff, the ducklings. But now with these guys in the river, it's unsettling for sure. And we've seen a big, I'd say a big increase in the last couple of years, where,
Oh yeah,
especially down in Kentville, they haven't really made it up in numbers further up towards Berwick, but in Kentville, they've certainly established themselves.
And I know that they have spread everywhere. There's not a whole lot, as you said, in the upper reaches, just because it's a lot narrower.
Yeah,
It's
but
not
they're
prime
there.
habitat, but I've caught them there as well. And I've seen them in every single watershed in the river, and in almost every single tributary of the watershed, which is, yeah, it was only like 3.5 years since the first confirmed sighting. And now during the hot summer months, they're one of the most common species you can come across when you're fishing in certain areas. And it's extremely worrying. They eat everything. They devastate trout populations, and they just drastically reduce biodiversity, as has been shown throughout the province and other regions and rivers, where they've just completely taken over. So it's a tricky thing to work with, because so far there's been very little success throughout the Maritimes in dealing with the invasive chain pickerel. And at this point, it's almost more so looking for mitigation strategies, as opposed to trying to remove them, because it seems to be just such an impossible task. But it's something that we're going to continue to monitor, just in presence where they are, where most of them are throughout the year, just so at some point in time, luckily or hopefully, we can actually find a solid way to really deal with this problem. But for the time being, if there's any anglers out there, if you catch chain pickerel, please keep them. Please. It's encouraged. There's some signs up around the river these days. It was put in by Clean Annapolis River Project. It doesn't have a huge impact in reducing the pickerel population, but it can't hurt, because every pickerel that's in there is just guzzling down trout and native species.
I'm just going to mention, we've got an invasive plant in the watershed, and goes by the name of reed canary grass. This was brought in by farmers many years ago as a forage crop for livestock. The banks were cleared, and this grass, along with others, was planted and used as food for the livestock. But reed canary grass can grow up to 10 or 12 feet, and just completely takes over large areas of land and chokes out any sort of native plants, shrubs, trees. It just doesn't give a chance to anything. So we're seeing this widespread on the banks. If you ever look out and you see these huge fields of really tall grass,
Looks kind of like
that's-
wheat.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
usually what it is. It's reed canary grass, and it just by June, mid-June, it's just nothing else can grow there. So we haven't really got on to looking into ways to get rid of it or mitigate it, but
Yeah, I would say it's the dominant
It's-
plant species in the riparian area for the entire river, as well as many other rivers around Nova Scotia as well. It's just it's everywhere. And it's probably been there, I would say, for many, many years now. I would say it's 50 to 60, 70 years. So it's so hard to mitigate and deal with something like that, because I'm sure there might be solutions that you were talking about earlier in terms of just clearing areas and replanting them with native species. But Yeah.
as far as an entire area, it's a huge task.
all right. So overall, what have we found with the river's health? So it has high rates of erosion, which increases sedimentation, and all that means is just silt and sand and mud covers up rocks and cobble bottom. In most areas of the river, back in the day, it would have a cobble and gravel bottom, but now you can dig down sometimes up to 2-3 feet before you hit any rocks because there's so much sand that's built up. I'd say that's one of the major issues, as well as the pollution, the E. coli, and just general threats in general from agriculture and irrigation. However, with all that said, it does have a shocking amount of biodiversity, and it seems extremely resilient. And there's a lot of hope out there that with just a little nudge and a little, I don't know, pat on the back, and if everyone seems to be a little more engaged and involved with their local watersheds, I don't see any reason why we couldn't try to bring it back to some of its former glory. In terms of its health, it's very, very surprising how much diversity there is here. It's such a hot spot, and it's full of species, and nearly every single day we're on the river, regardless of whether we're working or not. And there's always something to see, always something cool. Just 2 days ago, I saw 3 bats flying around, which is incredible to see. Otters, beavers, minks, all sorts of waterfowl, you name it. So it's really got a whole lot of hope. There's a whole lot of hope out there for the river. So it's although it's troubled and it's had its fair share of degradation, there's certainly hope. So we're running a little over time here. I'm sorry. So what are the next steps in the future in the following years? There is an awesome project that we've got underway now in Berwick. And if you're familiar with Miners Marsh in Kentville, we're looking to implement a Miners Marsh-esque marsh right in Berwick, just down from the fire hall. There's an area of land there, and we've already got a lot of this underway. And right now we're just in the midst of providing some funding for this. So what this is going to look like is it's going to be, instead of adjacent to the river, it's going to be smack dab in the middle of the river, likely with a boardwalk and a path around it as well. And what this is going to do, it's going to be channeled so it doesn't swamp it or flood it out, but this is going to be excellent in filtering a lot of the contaminants that come from these rendering plants and sewage treatment plants, because if you have, as many people know, and it's been studied heavily, marshes have an incredible impact on being able to absorb nutrients and filter out toxins, as well as providing an excellent habitat and just a nice place to hang out, honestly. I love hanging out at Miners Marsh and marshes in general. They're fascinating ecosystems. We're also looking to implement some beaver dam analog structures, as we've identified a few of them in some of our sites. And you can always check in with us to see how any updates on our Instagram or Facebook page or website. We're going to be looking to do some tree planting and restoration of the cold water refugia areas that are identified. More continued water quality monitoring, some long-term with they're called an onset hobo logger. It's like every hour of every day, they take a temperature reading. So they're very handy. We're also going to be doing some cooperation with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans next year with their electrofishing project for salmon in the river, which is going to be great. It'll build up a bit of some baseline data that can be referred to in years to come. And there's also a large scale 5 to 10 year restoration project going on, which is through the Nova Scotian Federation of Agriculture, which is looking to build shelter belts between some of the farms that are adjacent to the riverbanks and doing other forms of riparian restoration. So how can you help? Because we would love your help, especially if you're in the area and you've got idle hands. We have a canoe raffle going on right now, and all proceeds are going to be going towards our the Marsh project previously mentioned. It's an awesome opportunity to, first of all, maybe win a really cool canoe, which is sweet. And also all the proceeds are helping or going towards an excellent cause. So check that out. Information's on our website and all of our social media accounts. You can also join the Jijuktu'kwejk Watershed Alliance on our website and become a member, which is excellent. Or if you look up, it's just watershedalliance.com. It's very easy to find. And if you're living in the watershed, we need more citizen scientists. So if you see a wood turtle or if you see any interesting thing whatsoever, take a photo of it, send it our way. It can be extremely helpful, or you can put it up there on iNaturalist as well. We've got an iNaturalist page, and it just kind of helps us gather more of a collective knowledge about the watershed in general. Check out our Instagram and Facebook pages. We have regular updates of what we're up to, often in terms of events as well. We have a number of events throughout the summer where you can get involved and hands-on, help us look for turtles, canoeing, whatever. It's great. And yeah, we always accept donations as well. So stay tuned for more events throughout the summer. And yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Keeler and Jonas, thank you for I'll say an amazing presentation. I love your enthusiasm, and I love the fact that so many times you said you were just having a lot of fun in the watershed. And I think that is so important, to be out there having fun, and because as you have fun and you're enthusiastic about this, people are going to get excited about what it is you're doing. So thank you so much. I wonder if you could stop sharing your slides, because then we can see more people on the and then I'd like to open it up for questions. So, and I think the best way, you can either, as usual, put your questions in the chat box at the bottom, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask questions. So fire away. I think there's all kinds of stuff to be talking about here. Any questions? Yes. Tobias, just unmute yourself.
There we go.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, that was an awesome presentation, first off. And I was also just wondering, because there's so many houses that live close to or like right on the river. And what about just like getting in contact with those people, and maybe with like some of the grant money, you could even like ask them if you could go on their land and plant trees along the riverside,
Yeah,
like saplings and stuff like that.
That's a good question, Toby. We actually we've been in the works with that, and we have a number of landowners. There's one on Black Rock Road there, and there's another on Shaw Road, which are areas that are quite eroded. And tree planting is one of those things that everyone loves. No one hates trees, and especially if they're not paying for it, no one's going to be complaining about having trees on their property. And they're so effective in providing shade and preventing erosion. So yeah, that's absolutely something we have in the works. And if there's anyone out there as well who's got any sort of land in the watershed, particularly along streams or the river, let us know, because that would be awesome. That's absolutely something we'd be interested in doing.
I was even thinking of like, what if you just like knocked on their door and talked to them for like 5 minutes, and you're like, this would be a huge help, especially for the years to come. And you could just get like a crew to go around to like a bunch of people's houses and get like the okay to plant a bunch of trees on their land.
Yeah, well, that is we need a lot of folks to do something like that. But I'm certainly not opposed to it.
I just think that would help.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
That was all.
All right. Well, thank you, Toby.
Thanks, Toby. I see there's a question from Elizabeth Coster, and this is: most areas that are heavily under agriculture suffer from too much nitrogen, causing eutrophication. And the question is, any idea here? If so, this relates to the impact of agriculture, I guess, and especially
yeah.
nitrogen.
I would say
Yeah,
algae.
yeah.
I would say algal blooms.
We see a lot of that.
There's a lot of that in the summer, particularly when there's a long period without rain. There's always going to be a little bit of algae, but there's periods where the water levels get so low that it's completely stagnant. Like you can't even tell the river's flowing. It almost pools up. And I would say that it's certainly all the nitrates and the nitrogen in general would certainly have an impact on how much algae is in the river. And that algae in turn then consumes a lot of oxygen, and it just overall lowers the water quality and reduces habitat.
When we
But you're not measuring nitrogen. That's what I was actually asking.
Oh, okay.
Oh, apologies.
No, don't worry.
No, we haven't. No, we
Okay.
stuck with one form of the water quality monitor right now. But that is something that we would love to do. I think we're going to be doing it this year. Actually, we're going to be renting one, I believe, from or using one with Clean Annapolis River Project, and I'm pretty sure that will have some more. Will be capable of measuring nitrogen levels as well as oxygen levels, because that's something that we haven't been able to measure either.
Right.
Yeah, I know, like the Estuarine Center at Acadia University, they have all kinds of measuring equipment for nitrogen and oxygen, etc. And I wonder if you could see if you could borrow some of their equipment.
We've looked into it before. Yeah, I think it just ended in it kind of got pushed under the rug, but yeah, it's certainly a good idea.
Well, that's too bad,
Yeah.
because I think that would be a wonderful. Like they have the equipment and they don't necessarily use it all the time. Anyways, I'll see what I can do. I used to be
That would
head
be
of power
excellent, because we can always use equipment like that.
Yes.
Actually,
Good.
we've been looking for a nice water quality monitor for a while now, because we've been
Right.
pretty restricted to the little Hannah probes, which they only have so much applicability.
Yeah, good. I have a question here. What species of trees are suitable for the wetlands?
Well, alders would be good. It's mostly, I mean, if you take a look at the river, there's willows, alders are along the banks. There's a certain birch tree that
Yeah, the
red birch, maybe,
no,
or-
white and gray. Yeah,
White and gray birch, yeah.
birches would be excellent, because they just have really great root systems and they take off quite easily. And there's just a whole lot of flooding that happens multiple times a year. So you want something a little resilient. But I would say alders would probably be the best one.
Yeah, because they provide a lot of shade. They branch out, and where they're so bushy, they grow quickly. Their root systems are big, and they provide support for the bank and provide shade.
And they spread quite quickly as well. But I would say the bottom line is if you can plant anything, that's great. Red maples, white birches, alders, willows would be the best, but as long as it's a native species, I wouldn't see any problem with it. Right now, there's a lot of buckthorn and Manitoba maple on the river, which on one hand, it's helpful because it is keeping these banks together, but again, it's not a native species, so it's kind of it's a little tricky.
Yeah, certainly providing shade is critical. But I wonder, will your understanding of the cold water refugia, could you identify certain areas where planting trees would be more useful than other areas, maybe?
Absolutely,
Certainly,
yeah. That was in fact one of our main goals this summer. Yeah, so we've have two key that we've already I guess we've contacted BlackRock yet. Yeah, we've already contacted landowners and we have some tree planting underway. And yeah, I think more or less the ones we found that were the most used and had the most biomass of fish, we've already got underway for tree planting. So
Excellent.
excited about that.
Yeah, good stuff. Any other questions?
Well, I see one there.
Okay.
Get up there. And Strong says, for your water quality analysis, how did you factor in the effect of the tidal flow from the sections near Kentville versus those near Berwick? So where we were doing the water quality in Kentville, we were doing it was by Kentville Walking Bridge. We made the one that's kind of behind the Ultramar, there's an old folks home there. We were only exclusively taking water quality at low tide. And when it's low tide, it's 100% fresh water. And the tidal, the salt wedge in the river doesn't extend quite to that point either. But what does happen is it does push up a lot of the river as the tide's coming in, but it doesn't ever end up flowing the opposite direction in that region. But yeah, we would only take it around low tide just to, ensure that it's a little more accurate in terms of the freshwater.
Right. Thanks. We have time for a few more questions. It's only 8:45, if there are any. If not, I might just mention that years ago, I was working in the Tribrook watershed area, which is part of the Jijuktu'kwejk watershed. And we were working, this was a project with the Department of Natural Resources, or the Wildlife Division. And we were trying to encourage farmers not to have cattle quite close to the rivers, and to leave the riparian areas alone instead of plowing right down to the water. Because riparian areas, which are the areas near the stream that are affected by the water, if you leave vegetation there, that vegetation in fact filters a lot of the nutrients that are running off the fields. And quite a few farmers were quite willing to take part in this program. And then of course, when you protect the riparian areas, then suddenly there's all kinds of habitat for all kinds of wildlife, birds and insects and such. So there are a lot of things that can be done, I think, to increase the health of the watershed. And often it's just understanding what small actions actually can have big outcomes. So I think it's wonderful that you guys are so excited about this watershed and putting the time in. So are both of you going to be working on this again this coming summer?
I will be.
You will be, okay.
Yeah, I'll still be involved as much as I can, but I'm doing a master's somewhere else in the sister watershed. So
Okay.
still back and forth, but no, not full time, certainly.
No, good. Okay. Any last questions by any chance? And if not, I want to thank you.
Actually, sorry to interrupt.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
To add to what you just said, there's a section on the Jijuktu'kwejk, and it's amazing. There's trees right up to the banks, which you don't see often or at all really on this river. And like you said, it's a whole different ball game. The bottom is cobble. There's not so much mud. It's filtering everything out. There's a nice shelter belt between the river and the Shaw Resources pit there in Coldbrook.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple of kilometers downstream is Lovett Road, the cow pasture there. And it's just a totally different river where there's, protection on either side.
Right.
Yeah, interesting to kind of, in some areas you can even, like, one side of the bank will be completely cleared, whereas another will be completely wooded. And you can just, by looking, side to side, you can just clearly see how one bank is perfect in its nice incline, where another would be like 7 feet tall and like overhanging, and just, and what a big problem I find with the erosion is, despite the sediment falling into the river, is as the river begins to widen, it gets shallower, so it's easy, it provides less habitat, and it's also a lot easier for it to be warmed up during the day by the sun and evaporate, so it causes all sorts of.
Yeah, one of the worst thing is when if there's a stream running through a pasture and the cattle are allowed to drink out of the water and they walk across the water, because cattle have this behavior that when they walk through water, they pee and defecate, adding all kinds of unwanted nutrients to the water. So it's really important to keep cattle out of the riparian area because they're so big and heavy that they cause all kinds of problems in the riparian areas. So part of this project that I was involved with was to encourage farmers to have fences to keep cattle out of the riparian area. And then, but see, it's easy, like it's easy to have cattle in the riparian areas because then you don't need to supply them with water because they just drink out of the stream. So when you fence the cattle out, you do have to supply water somehow. But there are lots of innovative ways of doing that. Anyways, I think that's probably it. Thank you so much for a. Is that a finger up you have, Jonas?
Yeah, I just have a.
Okay, sure,
one-
go for it.
yeah.
Go
Jonas,
for
you were saying about the Lovett Road, and you know how there's that massive farm and there's the cattle farm. So I'm wondering, is there any issue with the cows drinking, like let's say the water floods and there's a lot of E. coli, like 20,000 parts per 100 milliliters or whatever? Is that if someone's eating that cow, does that
I don't think so.
I don't think
no.
because
Yeah.
they deal with a lot of their own waste.
okay?
No.
I don't think it translates in that sense, but it is an issue. It's a threat to human health.
But it does go through plants.
Well, it doesn't. It's a bacteria, so it doesn't get absorbed.
Okay, right.
It doesn't, like, it kind of just passes through.
You'd have to
and
ingest the E. coli itself. in
Yeah,
the
you'd
water.
have to have just the E. coli. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Thank you. So thanks for a wonderful presentation and good luck with continuing it. And I think it's, I see a hand up. I'm Jane Mangle. You go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if, I'm quite aware that the Clean Annapolis project, there was a team of people that worked hard on cleaning up the Annapolis River. And I don't know a lot of details about what they've done or who they were, but I know that there was some success there. And I just wondered if you've worked at all with any of the folks that worked on the Clean Annapolis project, looked at, have they shared some of their information or their studies with you, or any of their resources or their equipment that was used in that project?
They have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, we're partners with Clean Annapolis River Project, and we share a lot of board members. So the head of Clean Annapolis River Project is actually a board member also of the Jijuktu'kwejk Project. So we do a lot of collaboration when it comes to stuff like that, and they've been extremely helpful, particularly because they've been so they've been rooted for quite a lot longer than we have as well. So we can kind of build off of their example. But I know they've kind of showed by example the right way to go about some of these things, and we can see what's been successful, what hasn't, and I don't know, they've been great. They've been extremely helpful. Yeah.
Wonderful to hear. Thank you for your hard work.
Oh, you're welcome.
No more questions now. I keep trying to finish. Anyway, thank you so much for a wonderful and enthusiastic presentation. It was great. And good luck, Keela, with doing a master's. That's exciting. And good luck, Jonas, with working on this watershed again this coming summer.
Thank you. I'm sure I'll have
great.
just as much fun.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, thanks guys. That was an awesome presentation.
Yes.